Last week's Parsha is a story of descent. It is the descent of Joseph into the darkness. And the verbs used in last week's Parsha are all verbs of going down. Joseph is thrown downward into the pit. He is then taken by the slave traders downward into Egypt. He then is placed in the home of Potiphar, and there things go even further south, and he is taken from there and thrown downward into the dungeons of Pharaoh. His trajectory is resolutely down, and just when he thought could get no lower, down again. This week's Parsha is the opposite. It is the story of an ascent. It is the story of coming up from the deep, dark dungeon of Pharaoh, as high as it's possible to go, to the point where Pharaoh will say to Joseph in this Parsha, the only thing that separates you and me is the throne. You will be equal to me in all things, except I'll still be Pharaoh of Egypt and you won't be. But you will be prime minister, you will be in the key decision-making power, not over some rinky-dink place, but over all of Egypt, one of the great empires of the ancient world. As far down as Joseph fell in last week's Parsha, his rise will come up even higher than he was before. In a lot of ways, this story of descending and arising is then a foreshadowing of the story that will happen to the whole Jewish people come a couple of weeks from now. The whole Jewish people will relocate to Egypt at the largesse of Joseph. They will prosper there and do well and multiply exceedingly. This family will turn into a substantial force. And that force will lead the Egyptians to start to get nervous. And we start the book of Exodus in a couple of weeks listening in to a scene between Pharaoh and his courtiers where they're discussing this new rising Israelite presence. And Pharaoh says, we have to be smart about this, get them under control before they rise up high enough to become a threat to us. We need to bring them down into slavery. And the story then of our people becomes a story of treacherous descent, of going from a position of relative security to a position of abject servitude, and eventually, before long, into a position of near genocide. Then we'll start the Moses story, and the pattern will repeat itself. The people who has descended to the depths of darkness and servitude will then start their quick rise up. And that rise won't just stop where they had previously been. That rise will continue and will take them all the way to a sea that will split in front of them and to a mountain where God will come down and offer God's Torah to them. The descent and ascent of Joseph is the individual. The descent and ascent of Israel is the collective. In many, many ways, our story as a people has been a story of descents and ascents. The Hanukkah story is the same kind of a story. We descend down into persecution under Antiochus only to rise up and have our light shine out in the darkness. The story of Purim is the story of our near genocide in ancient Persia, descending to the depths of vulnerability, before we are lifted up to triumph at the unlikely hands of a Persian Jewish beauty queen. Our whole story, all the way through the centuries, the millennia, has been a story of going down and of rising back up. And if we don't believe that it's still going on, just look at the history of the Jewish people in the last 100 years. It is mind-boggling to me that in May of 1944, the deportation of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz was just getting started. And in May of 1948, Ben-Gurion stood on a balcony in Tel Aviv and announced the reestablishment of the Jewish state after 2,000 years. In the span of 4 years. That's insanity. That's insanity that we should have our deepest dive, our darkest, blackest time, and our greatest eruption of light, certainly our greatest eruption of light in modern Jewish history, not within the same century or millennia, but within the same decade. Our story is always a story of descent and ascent. Our story is always the story of going down into the darkness and then coming up to greater and renewed light. That's also the content, by the way, of the dreams that Joseph interprets for Pharaoh. Right? Joseph's way out of the dungeon is by applying that skill of dream interpretation, which actually once had pissed off his brothers so much that they started off by throwing him in a pit. He uses that same skill with Pharaoh, and Pharaoh had dreamt of 7 fat cows and 7 emaciated cows, of 7 thick life-giving stalks of wheat and 7 rotten stalks of wheat. And what Joseph says to Pharaoh is, there will be times of plenty and there will be times of scarcity. And so in the times of plenty, don't get too cocky. Don't get too comfortable, because the times of plenty will not always last. And in the times of scarcity, do not allow yourself to fall into despair, because it won't always be emaciated cows and rotting wheat. It will also be times of richness, of sustenance, and of communal health. That when we are in the position of having everything we ever dreamt, we need to know that we could lose it in a second. And when we are in the position of being in the deepest possible darkness, we have to know that that's not the end of our story, that there is still the possibility of light and ascent from there. I think one of the benefits of being part of a 3,000-year-old people, a people who has all of this history behind us, is it gives us the opportunity to not just gain intelligence, but to gain wisdom. Wisdom comes from looking at the ongoing story of the past and recognizing how it's playing out again and again in the state of the present. We have all experienced time when it feels like our ascent will never stop, when life is good and getting better and better, and we need in those moments to be aware and to be prepared that anything could happen, and to not allow ourselves to fall into a lull of false security. And we have also, all of us, been down to the deep darkness. And we have felt the sense of that weight around our ankle that is just going to keep pulling us down and down and down and down, and that there is no possibility of ascent. But we look at our history, we look at our story, and we know that the descent is never the last chapter. That the darkness is never the last chapter. That in this season of Hanukkah and in this people over its 3,000-year journey, light has always won. The ascent has always come. And we are forbidden as Jews to fall into despair, because our story teaches us that the story itself is never done. Shabbat Shalom and Hag Sameach.